In the dark trenches of Mordor, they came out of the earth, bred of the subterranean heats and slime. Their deformed bodies foul, their nature as horrid as the land they hailed from. Orcs were the minions of Sauron and of Melkor before him, gruesome and sadistic, not a single bit of good at heart. But when comparing orcs to today's fantasy, orcs truly came a long way. And in this video I'll tell you a little bit about the history of the orcs and their evolution throughout the realms of fantasy, and how you may add your own flavor upon the most diverse of Tolkien-esque fantasy races out there. There is a general assumption that the orc, unlike the dwarves and elves, are a complete invention of Tolkien, with mere traces of mythological inspiration. But to those I say that there's more to orcs in mythology than most know. Like in many other cases, Tolkien was inspired by the poem of Beowulf. There, the orcs, or rather the Orkneyas, if I pronounced that correctly, were the sons of Cain, alongside of the elves, giants and ogres. Orkneyas in this case means demon corpse, or evil corpse or spirit. One such Orkneyas was Grendel, the monstrous enemy of Beowulf. The exact meaning of what Orkneyas actually meant is discussed to this day, as Tolkien himself adopted today's most widespread theory that the orc in Orkneyas comes from the Latin orcus, the underworld, which would imply that the orcs in Beowulf were undead originally. While the word orc as a dark and monstrous being may be the most noticeable item Tolkien took from the Beowulfian Orkneyas, their affinity to the earth is another thing. Orcs were originally bred out of the heats and slimes of the earth by Morgoth, while Tolkien later changed his mind, likely making the orcs into tortured, corrupted and broken elves instead. They continued to share their earthly nature. They live in dark caverns and high mountains, their presence alone dooming for most who must suffer them. And in the Steven Spielberg Lord of the Ring movies, the Orcs were born out of the earth. Tolkien described the orcs as ugly and filthy, their fanged teeth as crooked as their posture. Most are rather small. In The Hobbit, Tolkien even used the word goblin as the English translation of the Sindarin orc for most of the book. But in today's fantasy, goblins are usually something distinctly different from orcs. And if you want to know more about the evolution of goblins in fantasy, stay subscribed, as I might pick up this topic in the future. Orcs were generally mean-spirited and sadistic. They were cannibals and were hungry for the flesh of men, but didn't care if they ate orc flesh instead. They hate themselves, they hate each other, and they hate Sauron. Yet the orcs are not inherently evil. They have a sense of morality, just like men. Instead, they were brought to evil by Melkor and Sauron, a quirk of Tolkien's Catholic worldbuilding I rather appreciate over a true inherently evil race of orcs. As in Tolkien's worldview, every being has a soul, and thus every being has the possibility to be turned to good. As orcs in Tolkien's works were intended to be minions that turned to evil, slaves to their dark master, who was basically the setting Satan, followed by his second in command. Any orcish redemption never really came to be, as it was never the point of the books. And I really don't want to see anyone even dare to attempt an orc redemption story in any Tolkien media. But as everyone watching this video most probably knows, Tolkien's orcs wouldn't remain the only orcs in the realm of fantasy. With the release and subsequent popularity of Dungeons & Dragons, the floodgates opened for orcs to become a staple of fantasy even beyond Tolkien. And unlike the hobbits, which they had to turn into halflings, the orcs were allowed to keep their name. In the original bunch of official Dungeons & Dragons settings, orcs stayed quite similar to their Tolkien-esque counterparts. In Blackmoor, the original Dungeons & Dragons setting, the orcs were almost akin to beastkin, and varied in shape, form and physique due to their bestial features. But they were just as savage, plundering the spoilers. They followed a demonic entity called the Egg of Coot that pushed them further into the demonic realms. In Greyhawk, Gary Gygax's personal setting, the orcs varied wildly in appearance because of frequent crossbreeding. For the first time, they were described as burly, closer to orcs as in their natural appearance, rather than frail goblinoid orcs. But they were completely evil. They aren't inherently evil per se, but their patron god Grooms certainly forces them to keep their natural evil alignment, as they fervently believe that all other races are inferior to the orcs, and that all their possessions rightfully belong to Orcdom, which is why they plunder and steal and kill and maim. Here in Greyhawk, the crossbreeds of orcs like half-orcs became more important as well. While most stayed evil and savage, many of these half-orcs turned to adventuring instead. Ed Greenwood kept the orcs mostly the same when writing the most well-known setting of Dungeons & Dragons, the Forgotten Realms. The orcs are large and burly. They have grey skin and red eyes. They are aggressive, warlike, and have a horrible temper. Most orcs in D&D overall stay the same. There are exceptions like the orcs in Eberron. In Eberron, the orcs are spiritual people who act more like nature-nurturing elves in the setting, having only a reputation of being brutes. But overall, the orcs have a taint of savageness. They are generally the spoilers. Some of these aspects are turned to an uncomfortable degree, especially regarding the creation of half-orcs in Greyhawk. Overall, the orcs in Dungeons & Dragons turned away from being the slaves of a master or overlord. They became the spoilers and conquerors not in the name of an overlord, but of their god, who represents themselves. The emancipation of orcs might just be the most important step D&D has done for Orcdom. Yet it wasn't the only one, as orcs became larger, burlier, to set them more apart from goblins, who became their own distinct thing over the years. While in the United States, nerds created D&D out of games like Chainmail, the British nerds created Warhammer out of the same, creating their own flavor of orcs along the line. Warhammer orcs and goblins might be the most unique version overall. They are highly primitive, green-skinned brutes. They are basically known as the scourge of civilization, as the moment orcs get somewhere, they are almost impossible to get rid of completely. They spread like a plague, always looking for the next fight, the next combat. Their entire life revolves around their desire for combat, and you can't even call them evil, as they are too simple-minded to actually be evil. They are combat-driven. They sure do mischief, like pooping all around the place after raiding a city, but they aren't evil in the same way as orcs are in Tolkien or in the D&D settings. Luckily, they are so hungry to fight that they'd rather fight themselves and each other than waiting a day or two to bring the fight to somebody else. Oh, and don't forget their brothers in the Warhammer 40k setting, where they are basically the same, just in space. And how do they fly, you might ask? Simple. They believe very strongly. The more orcs there is in a warband, the more sophisticated the orcs become, and the better their machinery turns out to be. Their rust buckets called ships shouldn't be able to move or fly or even get into any form of faster than light travel, but they do it anyways, since the crew believes in it. Which goes for everything else as well, considering their over-the-top machinery. So what has Warhammer done for Orcdom, you might ask? I'm not that sure. Their impact is surprisingly contained. No other setting I know has orcs that are warlike, ever fighting mushrooms, who are the happiest people in their setting and who just have to believe in themselves to become stronger. And despite being rather isolated in their Orcdom, the orcs of Warhammer might just be the most iconic. orcs should never be the same after Warcraft touched them. Interestingly enough, Blizzard originally planned to make Warcraft orcs and humans into a Warhammer orc RTS, but they failed to get their license. Thus, Warcraft was born. While the original Warcraft orcs were pretty generic, they had some features taken from the Blackmoor setting of D&D, as the orcs were enslaved by demons who used them as cannon fodder to invade the then poor kingdom of Azeroth, now called Stormwind. While the story turned out to be more intricate with the second entry in Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3 at the latest redeemed the orcs within the story, coining them into something new altogether. From Warcraft 3 on, the Blizzard orcs turned into noble savages. In the story of Warcraft 3, they were able to free themselves from the plight of their demonic overlords by killing the demon whose blood they drank to get their brutish frenzy to begin with. In the end, they were another victim of the same old question on why people are evil in the Warcraft setting. They are generally corrupted by something or someone else. The Blizzard orcs might be savage in their culture, but under their war chief thrall, the orcs were a force fighting for the good upon the world of Azeroth, mostly. They usually aided the Alliance when it came to protect the world. The different orc clans kept their warrior culture, but they just stopped being differently specialized, mindless attack drones of the demonic legion and evolved into multifaceted cultures that were focused on other things than just war. The individual orcs became characters that were able to express something other than the desire for destruction. They turned into people who might be just as smart and charismatic as any human. The Warcraft orcs became the very incarnation of noble savages. And well, besides that, Warcraft made people horny for orcs. Warcraft had an impact on orcs like no property else since Tolkien. The noble savageness of orcs spread like wildfire, while others decided to make their orcs even more irredeemably evil to counter the wave of noble savageness. As a world builder, you'd be able to place your orcs somewhere on that scale. Some might say there is a third option, developed in the mythical lands of Japan, where orcs turned into something closer akin to pigs. There are several theories on why that happened, from orcs looking akin to pigs in some older D&D source books, over to a game called Wizardry that had piggish orcs and heavily influenced JRPG development. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed my little history of the orcs and fantasy. If so, consider subscribing for more world building and fantasy videos in the future. See ya!